So hi everyone, welcome to our first Wednesday of the month at noon series we've been offering on Team CBT from Feeling Good Institute. So our topic for today is CBT experts answer tough questions on defeating temptations and establishing healthy habits. Not the most succinct title. It's kind of a part two to a CE presentation that we did for many of you last month. And if you weren't there in our presentation last month, not to worry, because we are going to be touching on some of the really important sort of themes of what we talked about last month and kind of reiterating the things that you had particular questions about, kind of reinforcing those today. And then we'll also be leaving a lot of opportunity to answer questions live. So it's kind of a flexible and casual get together where you can have an opportunity to send questions in and we'll answer them. We're also going to answer some of the most common questions that we received in the webinar that we did last month. So if you do have questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and enter them in the chat box. You can send them to me. So send them to Jill Levitt. You can't chat the whole group, but you can chat the hosts and co-hosts. So send me a chat just asking me a question. And then when it comes time for Q&A, I'll kind of open up and we'll answer as many questions as we can. So I'm going to start by introducing you to today's presenters. I'll start with Richard. So Richard Lamb is a licensed marriage and family therapist with Feeling Good Institute in Mountain View, California. He's a graduate of Palo Alto University and a member of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. He currently provides short-term therapy for anxiety, OCD, habits and addictions, depression, and relationship concerns using cognitive behavioral therapy. And Richard is not only a therapist, he's also a dedicated educator. As a trainer and a mentor and an educator, he imparts the insights of David Burns's model of CBT that's known as Team CBT. Richard hosts the Feeling Good Therapist on YouTube, featuring therapy techniques demonstrated by fellow therapists. And he's a certified level 5 master therapist and trainer in Team CBT therapy. And I'll introduce you to Stacy. And Stacy Clark has been a licensed marriage and family therapist for over 25 years with extensive experience in crisis intervention and emergency mental health. She's a graduate of UCLA and she holds a master's degree from USC, and she enjoys working with individuals and couples who are struggling with depression, anxiety, relationship, parenting issues, attention concerns, ADHD, PTSD, trauma, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And she's a level 2 certified Team CBT clinician who practices in person in Southern California and then throughout California via telehealth. And Stacy looks forward to sharing her insight and skills with you here today. And our third featured presenter, Marshall Pagaling, is not going to be with us today. He had a family medical situation that he had to attend to. And so I'll be kind of stepping in the role of Marshall today and try to do him some justice. I was just going to make sure this slide was here. I thought I had skipped it actually. So let me just tell you a little bit about who we are at Feeling Good Institute, and then we'll move to the kind of heart of the presentation and talk to you all about tempting thoughts and habits. So Feeling Good Institute, we're really dedicated to the mission of alleviating suffering in our patients by elevating the practice of therapy. So we both provide treatment for patients, and we also provide a lot of training for therapists. We train and certify therapists in the processes of evidence-based CBT that are known to be most effective. So things like the use of measurement with our patients, empathy skills, working on motivation and reducing resistance, and then of course the classic cognitive and behavioral therapy skills. Therapists with Feeling Good Institute are really highly skilled and vetted. We engage in a weekly system of continuous improvement. We actually use the deliberate practice model, which we're going to be presenting to you all next month in the first Wednesday of the month didactic next month. So hopefully you can tune in for that. We also offer clinical services to meet clients' needs in person as well as on video across the United States and Canada. And then we offer lower fee options. We offer intensive therapy options where people come into town to work with us in person for many hours a day, many days a week, in order to really expedite the process of therapy, and as well as kind of traditional therapy. So I'm going to turn it over to Richard to get us started. Richard's going to share a story with us.
Great. Thanks, Jill. Really excited to be here today. And just so everyone knows, I think I drank a lot of coffee today. So I probably have a coffee addiction that if I'm like running in the background or something, just so you know, it's just me having too much caffeine. So I want to share this story. So Jimmy, a 35-year-old married man, software engineer, comes to therapy and he tells me his story. So Jimmy got a high position as a software engineer 6 months ago. And he remembers the celebration of getting the job. Cheers. He remembers the oh shit moment when he realized I'm an imposter. He remembers the critical feedback of the performance reviews. He remembers the panic before work. He remembers the stress after work. Every moment after this is a blur. Except Jimmy remembers his wife saying to him, "You aren't the Jimmy I married. I don't know if I can continue like this." You see, Jimmy is not drinking like water like I am today. He was drinking 1 to 2 bottles of wine per day. In therapy, he discovered his tempting thoughts. Wine will make me feel better. One more drink can't hurt. He identified the distortions, the emotional reasoning, the minimization. He used the devil's advocate technique. He says, "You say to me, one more drink can't hurt, but it's never just one more. And it hurts. It's hurting my wife, my chances of a family, everything I worked so hard for. No more. I'll do whatever it takes to fight you, devil." Today, he remembers the challenge of the temptations. He remembers the hard work he put in therapy. Most importantly, he remembers the tools he has learned to help him overcome his addiction. My hope is that we all can help people like Jimmy overcome their addictions and their habits. Next slide, please. So not only do I want us to help others overcome our habits and addictions, my personal belief is being able to practice what we preach. And we all struggle with addictions. Last month, we took a poll of everyone who joined our training, and roughly about 70% of us struggle with one of these: smoking, drinking, overeating, physical inactivity, insufficient sleep, procrastination. And I just even shared one earlier about my coffee drinking. And we all struggle with certain unhealthy habits or habits that don't serve us. And my hope is this kind of gives us a little more empathy for those who struggle with addictions and habits, and to be able to use these skills not only for others, but also for ourselves as well, because the majority of us experience it.
Thanks, Richard. So, yeah, I think the goal, oh goodness, the formatting didn't turn out so well as I downloaded this into PowerPoint. Sorry about that. My hope, yeah, is that we will not only all be getting some tools today and asking questions about tools today that we can use with our patients, but actually these are tools that we can use to tweak and to change kind of commonplace habits that many of us experience. I don't know anyone who doesn't have moments of procrastination these days. That one in particular seems so common. So the model that we're going to be talking to you about today and answering questions about today is this model. It's really a cognitive model of tempting thoughts and addictive behaviors. And this really, we totally recognize that there are many other ways to work on habits and addictions. So this is definitely not, the only way, but this is the way we'll be talking about today. And so many of you who do CBT or know about CBT, of course, know the cognitive model that comes into place for depression or anxiety. And that is that we would enter a situation. Let's say I have test taking anxiety. I'm going to take an exam and I have the thought that, oh my goodness, I didn't study enough for this exam and it's just so important. And then I would have a feeling like anxiety or stress, worry, pessimism. And then maybe I would have a behavior like an avoidance type behavior, or maybe an over preparation behavior or something like that. And so it's kind of, we're very familiar thinking about depression and anxiety through this kind of cognitive model. And essentially, we want to bring that same lens to thinking about habits and addictions, which is that we enter a situation and we may have some tempting thoughts that come up for us. So let's imagine that I was trying to decrease or control my drinking and I was driving home from work and I might be feeling, kind of stressed from the end of the day. And then I actually see a bar that I'm driving by that I've had some fun times with friends. And maybe I have the thought, oh, I wonder who's in there. And maybe I could just get one drink, and one drink would really help me to kind of feel calm and settled. That sounds really appealing. And, these kinds of thoughts would lead to emotions like excitement or temptation or pleasure or curiosity. And then these feelings, right, could lead to the behavior of kind of pulling over, parking my car and seeing who's inside. And then on the other hand, also we can teach and help our patients to identify those tempting thoughts. We can also talk back to them and we can have self-control thoughts. Like, for example, I could be telling myself, no, actually it's never one drink and one drink isn't going to do you any good. And let's, skip the bar and drive home and call your best friend who's going to remind you why it's a good idea not to drink. And so we can use kind of thoughts to really change and control the outcomes with habits and addictions. And the way that we do that, actually, we use this tool that's called a habit addiction log or addiction habit log. We seem to go back and forth on it. And this is a tool developed by David Burns. It's very much like a daily mood log or a thought record. We want to identify a particular moment in time, a tempting situation. This would be before we're tempted to engage in that habit that we really want to work on. And we're going to help our patients to identify the feelings that are coming up for them in that moment. They could be pleasurable feelings like tempted or excited, or they could be negative emotions like anxious or stressed or worried. And we're going to help our patients to think of what are the thoughts that seem to be driving those behaviors, right? What are the thoughts that come through my head that really kind of push me to do that thing, and help them to identify those tempting thoughts. We also talked to you guys last time about identifying cognitive distortions, which we are not going to go through again today. The one method we're going to just share with you again today in a role play, and then the rest of the time we'll spend for questions and go over some questions we already got and field some of your new questions. But this one method we wanted to just reinforce because we got lots of questions about it last time is called the devil's advocate technique. So this is a role play technique, and we only do this after we understand what the patient's, tempting situations are, tempting thoughts, etc. In this role play technique, the patient is going to play the role of themselves. So that's kind of easy. The therapist is going to play the role of the kind of devil on the patient's shoulder, tempting them to engage in that unwanted habit. So we're going to use the tempting thoughts the patient has given us on that habit addiction log. We've got a list of all the thoughts that kind of get in their way and tempt them. And the therapist is going to use those tempting thoughts in this role play. So the therapist will play the role of the tempter, the devil on the shoulder, and the patient's role is to talk back to that tempting thought to generate kind of a self-control thought. And we always want to make sure the patient writes it down. And then the role of the therapist, remember, the more tempting you are, the better, right? So the more kind of over the top and tempting you are, almost the easier it is for the patient to be like, no, 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 I'm not going to do that. So I'll just briefly mention, this is Marshall's patient that he presented last time. So Marshall worked with a patient whose name is Brian. And again, we always disguise identity. But Brian is a 25-year-old who's really a very bright and ambitious young man who's a college graduate, and he's a musician. And in addition to working a full-time job, he has this kind of passion or this mission of wanting to raise money to bring music to underserved communities. So he feels really passionate about it. But as a result of his passion and his ambitions, he's feeling really eager to raise a lot of money quickly. And he's feeling kind of desperate that the money he's making at work isn't enough. And so he actually turns to gambling to try to earn some money quickly. And what would happen would be a Friday night after a long day of work where he feels actually, you know, kind of excited and optimistic about earning some extra money so he can get his project off the ground. And then as he starts to lean into the gambling, he certainly has emotions like anxious and concerned. But his tempting thoughts and his initial feelings are excited and optimistic, and he has tempting thoughts like, one spin and I can be rich. And then when he does engage in his beginning the gambling, he has further tempting thoughts, even if he's behind, like, oh, but I can just make it up on the next spin. And of course, there are lots more tempting thoughts, but we're just going to do a quick demo for you of the devil's advocate technique using Brian's example. So I'm going to play the role of the therapist in this, and Richard is going to play the role of the patient. And so I would say to you, Richard, my patient, I'll just call you Richard for the demonstration. Or I'll call you Brian for the demonstration. So Brian, I'm going to try a method with you that's called the devil's advocate technique. And it's a role-playing method. So you can be yourself, you can be Brian, and I'm going to play the role of the devil, you know, those angel devil cartoons. I'm going to be the devil sitting on your shoulder, really trying to tempt you to gamble now. And I'm going to use all your tempting thoughts that you've already shared with me. And I'm going to really try and push you in this role. And then your role is actually to talk back to those tempting thoughts, to kind of put me in my place and put your foot down and refuse to engage in that in the gambling behavior that you and I have been working on. Does that make sense to you?
It does.
Okay. So I'm going to get us started. So yeah, Brian, I know you really want to go and gamble, and remember, just one spin and you could be rich. You could make all the money for your musical venue.
It's never just one spin. Every time I spin once, if I lose, I want to spin again until I win. But every time I win, I want to spin again because I don't want to lose my winning streak. So it's never just one spin. And the odds of making it really big, I looked online, it's 3 million to 1. So it's very unlikely that I'll win big and make it rich.
Great. And I'm writing that down meanwhile. And then I'm going to ask Richard, or sorry, Brian, who won that? Was that you or was that me?
Oh, I definitely won that one.
Yeah, that seemed like a huge win. So then we would both write it down. We'd make sure that we got kind of all of that down on paper. And that was definitely a really strong response. So then I would move on to the next one. So let's give it one more try. Brian, you know, let's imagine you're now in this situation. You've done a bit of gambling and you're kind of down a little bit, right? So I'm just going to remind you, but don't worry, Brian, like you just got to keep going. You can make it all up on the next spin.
I mean, you tell me that, but I never make it up in the next spin. I always lose. I'm in the negative right now, and I continue to be in the negative. And the more I listen to you, the more negative I'll be. So I'm never going to make it up.
Great. And who won that, Brian? Was that you or me?
For sure, it's me.
Yeah. Okay. And so then again, we'll write that down. And we just wanted to give you kind of a quick and dirty, a quick and easy demo here. Obviously, it doesn't always go so easily, and we can answer questions about that when we get to the Q&A, but rather than giving you kind of too much info and too many scenarios, we want to kind of turn it over to you. We want the rest of the info that we share with you today really to be driven by your questions. We're going to start out with questions that you posed to us during the last webinar that we ran out of time. So I'm going to turn to Richard and Stacy to answer these. I have 6 questions on the screen in the next 2 slides. My formatting turned off here too. At the last minute, I decided to download it as a PowerPoint thinking that would be better. So I won't do that next time, but hopefully you'll all forgive me for the minor formatting issues here. So let's go to the questions. And then while I'm asking and answering these questions, please feel free to send new ones to me in the chat box. And then the 3 of us will take some turns answering your new questions. So one question that we got last time that I'm going to ask you to answer for me, Richard, is, let's say that the client is stating negative thoughts and tempting thoughts. So should we fill out a daily mood log at the same time as that habit and addiction log? Or is it better to tell them that we're going to save those kind of negative thoughts for later and then only write down and focus on the tempting thoughts?
Oh, that's a really great question. And a lot of my students probably know I give very unsatisfying answers. And the reason why is it depends. And the reason why it depends is it really depends if they're working on decreasing their moods or changing a behavior. If they are sharing negative thoughts, we can change their moods. But if they're wanting to change behavior, we can change the habit behind it. One thing I would recommend to everyone is taking as much notes as possible, even if you're working on like tempting thoughts. If they're sharing negative thoughts, I'm going to write that on the side, just so that way I know where I can use this in the future. Oftentimes, what happens is people want both. They want to work on decreasing their moods and they want to work on changing their habits and addictions. So the best thing that we can do is just get as much information as possible. We'll use it later. I don't want to overwhelm the patient with too much information. So I'll just keep it for myself to store and use again later and jot it down. And getting as much information is helpful.
Great. I think that's a great answer. We're going to stay focused on the habit and the addiction, but we're going to recognize, right, these thoughts that are coming up that probably are going to need to be addressed, you know, if the patient wants help with working on the depression or the anxiety or whatever those negative thoughts are related to. So I'll ask you the next one, Stacy. A patient said, I wonder about also applying alternative ideas that could become options for tempting thoughts. So like what else would be healthier for me to eat instead of eating sweets?
Now, this is a great question because it allows me to address that the devil's advocate technique, that we just modeled both in our last presentation and just now, is actually one of many powerful tools that we have to help our clients change their behavior. As Jill and Richard said, it really depends on what the client is wanting help with, if it's a mood issue or a behavior. But I think this question is addressing, focusing on healthier options instead of focusing specifically on the negative behavior or the tempting thought. And there are definitely other ways to do that. So for instance, they might want to work on like a problem solution list, which would help the client generate healthier alternatives. And this can be really beneficial because the client does this when they're not tempted, which in turn can also make it easier for them to implement this when they are tempted. But for someone who's struggling maybe with other issues, they might want to complete, say, an anti-procrastination worksheet, or maybe do a cost-benefit analysis, or maybe a double paradox table, which this helps the client think differently about their habit or addiction. So some of you may be familiar, but for some of you who aren't, the double paradox table asks them to list both the benefits and advantages of continuing to use versus the drawbacks or disadvantages of their new goal behavior. And there's also, a triple paradox, or a kind of positive reframing table for habits and addictions that's similar to the double paradox, but it also asks them to look at, what are their core values? What are their habits and addictions or what is the habit and addiction showing about them that's actually positive and awesome. So, there's lots of different ways that we can address this, and these are just a few of the tools that are available. But I think it's really important to remember that we don't just start throwing tools and methods at clients, that we work within the team CBT framework. So we first always start with testing and then only move on to methods after we've received an A on empathy and work through the agenda setting and assessment of resistance.
Okay, awesome. So let's go to the next one. Richard, would you recommend applying the devil's advocate technique after teaching thought challenging techniques, or is this something that could be used in place of that?
So when it comes to this one, people come in with different ways they perceive the world, different values, different things that are important to them. So at the end of the day, what I want to do is I want to offer them an invitation of, hey, do you want to work on feeling better about this, or do you want to work on changing it? And you're going to have different outcomes, different skills and tools for each. So when it comes to thought challenging techniques, it'll help them feel better, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things will change. However, if they want to work on the habit and change things, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll feel better. However, one of the things is sometimes they want both. And at this point, it's either up to us to determine which one to work on first, or it's up to the patient which one. It really depends based off of the habits and or addiction that they're facing. So it could be a good option to do some devil's advocate technique after thought challenging techniques, or vice versa. So it's really going to be dependent on the patient that comes in and what they're struggling with and their background and what they care about and their values.
Yeah, and I was going to also say a super simple answer to this question would be that the devil's advocate is a thought challenging technique, right? I mean, it is a tempting thought challenging technique. So I'm guessing implied in this question is sort of like the first question that we got, like that someone is seeing the difference between, let's say, negative thoughts, like I'm a loser, and tempting thoughts, like I should have a drink. And, obviously then we're deciding, as Richard said, what is the person's agenda? What do they really want help with? Do they want help feeling better about themselves and not changing their behavior? Do they want help changing their behavior? And of course, if they want both, we're still figuring out where do we want to start. But I did just want to point out, actually, the devil's advocate technique is a thought challenging technique for tempting thoughts, right?
Absolutely. Can I just chime in on one more thing, Jill, around that one? I think oftentimes people ask me, I don't really understand the difference of what is a negative thought and what's a tempting thought. I know we covered it last week or last month rather, but it might be helpful to distinguish the two, where the negative thought creates negative emotions and the tempting thought encourages you to get relief or get some positive emotion out of it. So for me, when it comes to my coffee addiction, I don't want to feel guilty anymore. So I'll probably just work on decreasing the negative thoughts so I feel better and continue drinking coffee. However, when it comes to eating too much hot Cheetos, I might want to decrease that because I don't feel as healthy eating that many hot Cheetos. So I work on my tempting thoughts to decrease my behavior rather than my emotion behind it.
Yeah, and we also want people to know that all the examples we're giving are personal examples, things like that. The whole point is that the goal, like, is it important to not eat hot Cheetos? Only if that's incredibly important to the patient, right? For many people, that would be a perfectly fine and reasonable behavior. And so we're always trying, and people who know kind of the framework of Team CBT, we're always trying to meet the patient where they're at and really understand what is their goal and why is that important to them. They sort of have to convince us that they want to change, and then we have lots and lots of tools to help them get there. Let me go to the next question. So Richard, what would you recommend for clients with eating disorders who struggle with both binging and restricting? This person said sometimes they can get into cycles where there are two devils on their shoulder. So tell us about that. Also, I just want to say, if someone raised their hand, instead of raising your hand, just enter your question in the chat box. You can just send it to me, to Jill, in the chat box.
Well, First, I just want to say disclaimer is eating disorders are very complex, and there's a lot of nuances when it comes to how to handle eating disorders, where you can include family interventions and also other things as well. So definitely when it comes to eating disorders, look into it a little bit more, consult with experts. And just to answer this question, of course, we'll use a lot of different skills and tools. However, when it comes to devil's advocate technique, you are facing two different habits, one of binging and one of restricting. And we just fight both of those devils and use the devil's advocate technique to create self-control thoughts for both to find a balance.
Great. And then someone asked, Stacy, I'll ask you this one. Someone asked, oops, what about harm reduction? Can you use the devil's advocate technique to reduce problematic drinking, but not aim for total abstinence?
Yeah, I love this question. And I especially like the growing focus on harm reduction because, again, it emphasizes meeting the client where they are. And that's really, as Jill mentioned, it's something that's really the cornerstone of Team CBT. We're not here to force anyone to change based on our values or beliefs. In fact, we often discover that there are many good reasons not to change. So we really need to know what the client wants to work on. I think we keep saying that, but I think that that's really the crux of everything. So we definitely have tools to help them, but it's not up to us to decide what's best for our clients. So for some people, they will be about wanting to stop this unwanted behavior altogether, but for others, they only really want to make a reduction. And often we find that some clients actually don't want to change their behavior at all, but really they only want to feel better about it, right? That is to kind of accept themselves, flaws and all. So it really depends on what the client wants, and what they want will really change the types of tools that we use.
Great. Thank you, Stacy. And I'll ask you that last one, and then I'll turn to my chat box where I've got lots of questions. If a client is unable to challenge a tempting thought during the role play, do you treat it like you do in externalization of voices role play? Meaning, do you help them out? Do you do a role reversal? And that's similar, just to say that I got a similar question in the chat box. What do you do if the patient can't generate a self-control thought, or if they don't win, basically?
Yeah, I think this one is really difficult for the therapist, actually, because the devil's advocate technique is actually one of the few role plays where we don't want to reverse the roles. And I think it's really tempting for us, right? But it's not up to us to decide what's best for the client. And also you can't talk someone out of a habit or addiction, because it's really an issue of motivation. We don't want to be the one making the suggestions or helping the client, and doing that can actually increase resistance. So, in some ways, this technique, the devil's advocate technique, can not only be powerful, but it's also very informative, right? If they can't talk back to their temptations in the session with you in a safe environment, then that might actually tell you that this is not something that they want to change at all. Or after all, I guess, they may think that they want, but kind of if they're running into these issues and they're not able to do that, then that gives you information. So, remember that the thoughts that we're using in this role play, they're not just any thoughts or temptations that we generate. They're actually the client's own tempting thoughts. So again, this technique is very paradoxical, where clients have a chance to stand up to their own kind of internal bully of sorts, and then they have a chance to come to their own defense. And if they can't do that, then we as their therapists have to be okay with the client's choice, and we may need to sit with open hands. When we stop trying to convince them, then that actually gives the client the opportunity to convince us that they want to change. Or if they don't want to change, then we can offer an invitation to help them with something else.
One thing I want to add too, I 100% agree with you, Stacy. One thing that I've learned from when I was back as a intern, and I had this really amazing supervisor, Angela Crum. She taught me that there's a different way that we can approach this when they feel stuck. Where one thing I mentioned is we're always jotting down a lot of notes when we're hearing their story, hearing why they're motivated to change things. And one thing that could be really helpful is reminding them, hey, you mentioned this to me. Is this something that you can use in this role play with me? And just to help them remember what they shared in the past, not to give them answers, but to kind of share with them the answers they've already given you. So that way they have the power to fight back in these moments.
True. And I think Jill, you mentioned previously that sometimes looking at someone's negative thoughts and looking at the distortion in it can help give them some clues on how to fight back as well. But again, this is all stuff that's generated from the client. I think that's important.
Right. It's like we're kind of trying to strike a delicate balance of not spoon feeding the patient, not trying to convince them to change, not giving them information we already know that they have, right? But trying to, curiously wonder, did you, sometimes I'll even say, do you want to try it again? Take a minute. Did you want to give that another shot? Review the distortions. Think about some of the conversations we've had. Do you want to give that another shot? But the idea that we're trying to communicate here too, though, is that there is a lot of ambivalence in changing with habits and addictions. And we're going to be really careful not to try to get in the role of trying to convince our patients to change, because that always leads to intensifying resistance, right? And instead, we're going to really try and, we say, sit with open hands, meaning say, maybe that's not something you did want my help with. Maybe you don't need to change that behavior. And then oftentimes when we're willing to kind of pull back and say, very respectfully, and even empathically, it sounds like maybe that isn't something that you should have to change. Oftentimes the patient will kind of flip and then start to chase us and say, no, but I need to change because, A, B, and C. And so that kind of paradoxical approach can be really helpful. So we're going to turn to your questions now, and I'm going to kind of ask them of Richard and Stacy, and I'll be jumping in as well, kind of in order in which they came in. So someone had a question. They said, often when an image of a snack comes into my mind, it is during some anxious feelings. There's no thought initially. What is the evidence that behaviors are the result of thoughts, and how is that measured? And I have a sort of a bit of an answer to that. I don't know if it's a fully satisfying answer. I don't know the answer to exactly how is that measured. So what I can say is that it's very often my patient's experience and my own experience as well that I think I'm just driven to a behavior and there isn't actually a thought. And I think we all suspect that's because thoughts go through our minds so quickly. So we experience like feeling behavior and we don't actually experience the thought. And so in some ways, this idea of pausing and slowing down and wondering, what might you be thinking? What would be a thought that would go through your mind, even if it were just a thought like, oh, like chips would taste so good, or I really need a chip right now, or pretzels are so salty. Even if it's that kind of a thought, like basically my experience is that when I get patients to think, what might I be thinking? What do I imagine is driving this behavior? Slowing down, noticing those thoughts, and then practicing talking back to them in session. And then practicing, slowing down in the moment and challenging those thoughts in the moment is really effective. So that's my answer. Did either of you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I also wanted to add 100% agree, Jill. And I think the first process, and at the end of the day, I want to teach my patients to essentially be their own therapist so they don't need my help anymore. And one of the first processes that we need to do is to help them be more aware, to build awareness, to build mindfulness of what's going on internally, to sit back and observe their thoughts, their feelings in each situation. And once they fully understand, that's when the change can happen. So I do see this as a sitting back and just noticing, hey, what could have come up here? Like, what's going through my mind? What are some potential thoughts and feelings that are coming up? And that will help them to the next steps of change.
It's sort of like thinking when I drive a car, am I actually thinking? Well, there's thought going on, but I'm not actually saying, put your foot on the brake, put your foot on the gas. But at somewhat level I am, right? So it's slowing down and figuring out where is that thought? Because these are not reflexive actions. And that's part of what I think the beauty of cognitive therapy is slowing down, self-awareness, and then analyzing and changing thoughts. So someone had a nice comment that said, I used this technique recently with a client and it worked beautifully. It really helped the client shift to action versus just sitting in preparation stage. So I thought I'd just share that. Someone asked, is this technique useful for someone with process and outcome resistance? One of you want to take a quick stab at that? Richard, do you want to try that
Yeah,
one?
I'm happy to jump in. I just want to backtrack a little bit. I don't know everyone knows the lingo
Exactly.
behind outcome and process resistance, so I want to explain that first. So when it comes to outcome resistance, this is if they got the outcome that they wanted, the results that they wanted, why wouldn't they want it? Because there's something good that helps them for maintaining the status quo. And then when we think about process resistance, what do they have to do that they may not want to do to get the outcome that they want? So these are the two resistances that we usually run up to in therapy. And in order to make the change for habits and addictions, we do have to address these two, because there are certain benefits that people get when they have certain habits. For example, when someone has an addiction to TikTok, they get some sort of relief just watching these and entertainment. And maybe that's not what they want to give up. They still want the relief that they get from it. They still want the entertainment that they get from that. Alternatively, the process resistance is what do they have to do that they may not want to do? And what that is they have to find another source of how to decrease their distress, or they have to face their distress. And that might not be the thing that they want to do in order to overcome this. So the answer to this is yes, we would have to address both outcome and process resistance in order to help someone with their habits and or addiction.
Great. Whitney asked, do you tell the client in advance that you're going to play devil's advocate as a role play, or do you adopt the stance without the prior advance notice? And she says, the reason I'm asking is that I could see it being easy in therapy for the patient to give the right answer when they know that their therapist is sort of testing them in a role play, versus if you were not to set it up, like not to introduce it.
You know, I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think it's really important to introduce it and first of all get the client's buy-in, right? And let them know what you're going to be doing and making sure that that this is an experiential process, right? I think that even if they are kind of giving it, as the question asked, right, the right answer when kind of tested by the therapist, I think that the beauty of some of these methods are that it really brings the emotion into it. And so it's not just a kind of, I mean, one of the complaints about CBT is that it's just too cerebral and that it doesn't really lead to change. And I think that these role play exercises are incredibly powerful because it engages the client in a different way and it kind of cements that change. And when they get a win, they really get a win. I mean, it's a big win and they feel it in their gut, and that's something that they can hold on to. And I think the devil's advocate technique, definitely you always want to end on a big win, if you can, or, you know, again, it gives you information that maybe this isn't something that they want to change. So I think that definitely I would want to get their buy-in, and that even if they know that that sometimes they're just saying the right thing or what they should be saying, I guess is what that question kind of implies. I think it can still be very, very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one other reason for potentially introducing a method and saying, hey, we're going to use this method with you, is that then the patient can practice it as a method outside of session, right? As Richard said, we are always essentially trying to work ourselves out of a job. We're trying to teach our patients to be their own best therapist. And so if we're just kind of, asking cool questions in session and getting great responses, like on the one hand, that's great and it could make for pretty effective therapy. But on the other hand, the patient isn't learning something they can then kind of replicate and use on their own. So I think it's a great question, though. I appreciate that. So James said some clients are prone to externalizing their problems, such as presenting with the complaint being that their spouse is the cause of their unhappiness, or that their spouse is constantly bothering them about their weight or their drinking or their eating. And he says, what is an effective approach for this? And I'm happy to say a few words about that. I think it's very common in therapy that someone will come in complaining about someone else in their life. And maybe even that you as a therapist will be thinking, my patient's got some issues here that they're not really wanting to take a look at, and blaming it on their spouse. And actually, I feel very grateful. I feel like I've learned a lot in how to respond to these patients from training with David Burns. The idea that we subscribe to is that, again, we're not actually trying to change our patients against their will. And pretty often, if you were to call the patient on that and be like, well, I think your wife has a really good point, your drinking is kind of out of control, you're not going to do a whole lot to create a really positive and warm and therapeutic relationship, and you're probably going to hit a lot of resistance. And so we tried pretty hard, actually, to ask, questions like, well, yeah, it sounds like your wife is really nagging you a lot, and your wife isn't here, and unfortunately I wouldn't be able to change your wife's nagging behavior. Is there something in there that you would want my help with? Did you want my help, for example, in navigating your relationship differently? Or do you think you have a problem with drinking? If there are things in here that you want my help with, I would be so happy to help you. I've got lots of tools to either help you in your communication with your wife or to change your drinking, but you need to convince me, that you wanted help with that, and I'm here to serve you. And so essentially, we're not going to jump in and try to work on some agenda that we think or the spouse thinks the patient should work on. We're going to really try to understand what it is the patient wants help with, and then work on that as our therapy goal. Anything you guys want to add, or shall I move on to the next one?
I love to add that to that
Okay.
too, where I honestly believe everyone knows themselves a lot more than we do because we're not in their heads. We don't know their complete story, their background, what they've gone through. And each person's a little bit different. And if they're kind of coming in and they're telling me it's not a problem, and I think it is, part of this is I'm not going to be able to force them to do it because that's what they generally believe. However, if they're coming in and they're telling me my wife is the problem, then of course we can offer the option of, hey, do you want to work on this relationship to improve the relationship? And oftentimes what I've seen that happens, not all the time, oftentimes is when people start working on their relationship, they start to kind of see the other side of things and they realize, oh, actually, maybe I should work on this because it's making my wife very unhappy. Very similar to the case example that I brought in the beginning, where this person, his wife was about to leave him because of his drinking and his distracting from all the stressors in life. And part of this is he wanted to do this for his wife too, to make sure that his life is good and that her life is good too. So there's a lot of nuances when it comes to each person, and we can't treat everyone with the same exact thing. We have to understand to a deeper level, to the best of our abilities, because at the end of the day, we can't understand 100%. We have to understand to a greater degree so we can offer suggestions on what they could use.
Wonderful. Susan asked, with the devil's advocate technique, what about when the client already knows that the tempting thoughts are kind of untrue and unhelpful? Like, for example, in the role play, Brian was having big wins, but I suspect he was verbalizing thoughts that he's already had many times, perhaps every time he has the tempting thought. So why would this verbalization be effective?
I'll jump in. Yeah, I think again, it kind of goes back to what I was saying, that putting this into practice and playing this out really makes it real. I mean, I think we all have negative thoughts that just go on an automatic loop in our head. And sometimes we don't even believe them, but we don't even recognize that we're having these thoughts. And so again, it's part of that whole process of pausing, of slowing down, of really being mindful of what's going on. And so by verbalizing those thoughts, and then being able to talk back to them, it really strengthens that other position. I think it increases the client's motivation and gives them a way to talk back to those thoughts when they do pop up.
Great. And then, of course, we recognize let's imagine we did this with the patient and it was really effective in session, and then we give it to them for homework, and we said something like, well, so whenever you feel tempted, right? Even if you're like driving, you feel tempted, I want you to pull over on the side of the road, take out your habit addiction log, write down your tempting thoughts, talk back to your tempting thoughts, right? If they're actually committed and they're going to go through that action, and then they still go and gamble, or in this, I was thinking of the drinking example that I gave earlier, then maybe you do need to, use other methods too, right? Like it's not the only method, right? So maybe you need to have more of a behavioral action plan. Maybe you need to have more of a quick go to whenever that thought comes in, here's what you're going to do as an alternative. So you'll learn, right? You'll try it. If for some reason it works in session, doesn't work out of session, then you've got lots of other methods that you can use. But yeah, obviously we're presenting this one to you because we have had lots of great success with it. Let's see, someone else said, sometimes patients get stuck with a low number of items. I didn't read this one yet, so hopefully this will make some sense, but sometimes patients get stuck with a low number of items, for example, on a positive reframe, on a decision-making form, or on a cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes it doesn't matter as much. What about when patients get really stuck being creative? Oh, this is really a question about positive reframing, not a question about the habit addiction log. They were asking, when do we need to push them towards 20 plus? I can give a quick answer, but we'll move on just because lots of people in the audience won't know the methods that you're particularly talking about, which is we don't need to push patients to have 20 plus items on their positive reframing. That was ultimately the question. But obviously we do want to make sure that we have enough that are actually really powerful and meaningful, that you're kind of in this, have this vibe going with the patient where they really recognize that their symptoms, their thoughts, and their feelings show something really beautiful about them. I think we got all the questions. Someone, I think, was offering answer to a recent question, said that maybe getting patients acquainted with their thoughts gives their thoughts less power, which I think is a nice way to think about it too, right? Slowing down, identifying your thoughts. They're not as like kind of sneaky and working under the surface. So there's a few things we wanted to share with you at the end of the workshop. And then I mentioned in the chat box as well that there is I put a very brief survey, not nearly as long as the typical CE surveys. We're not offering CE credit, but of course we'd love feedback, as we always do. We always want to learn and grow. Is this useful? Is it helpful? What could we do differently next time we offer one of these Q&As? So on that workshop page where you found the Zoom link, if you just click complete and continue to the next little section, you're going to see a survey there, and it has maybe 9 questions, and we'd love it if you could give us some feedback. And then someone so kindly said, you guys are rock stars. Love your podcast. So that was nice. It's from someone named Richard, so it's probably not Richard Lamb, but if it were you, that was kind of sneaky. I'm just teasing. So we'll just have a few slides to share with you to finish up. So we have many students probably who are here who are currently in the fast track program. We've gotten really great feedback about this, and we're starting a new kind of cohort in June. And this is like a 5-month pretty intensive training program. It's what we call a hybrid program, where you can actually each week log in and watch pre-recorded home study didactic presentations with slides with myself and David Burns. And then after you do your kind of home study independent learning, each week you're part of a practice group where you actually have an opportunity to practice, get feedback, practice more, get more feedback, and really kind of master the skills that we're teaching in this kind of advanced CBT course. And so we're offering again in June, and you can find out more info on our website, and we'll follow up with an email with a registration link to you guys as well. We also really hope that you kind of put on your calendar the first Wednesday at noon of every month. We hope you can be with us. Next month, it's actually a continuing education training, and the topic is Elevate Your CBT Skills with Deliberate Practice. This is going to be taught by Maor Katz, Mike Christensen, and then two really amazing people who are very steeped in the deliberate practice literature, and they're going to be presenting with Mike and Maor, and I know that we're going to learn a lot. So I'll just finish by saying thank you all for joining us today, and thank you so much to Richard and Stacy. We hope that you all found it valuable and that you learned some new practical tools that you can use to help your patients to and yourselves actually to talk back to temptation. And if you're considering furthering your expertise in Team CBT, we do offer certification and training programs. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out to us about certification or training at our email address on the screen here, or check out our website. And lastly, if you know of anyone who could benefit from our services, whether that's a friend, a family member, a client, you can always check out feelinggoodinstitute.com to see therapists that are available and have expertise to help you or your loved ones. And as always, our commitment is to try to be helpful to you. We believe in the power of sharing knowledge and building meaningful connections. So if you have any other questions or feedback, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We're here to support you in any way that we can. Hope that you have a wonderful day, and hope that we can see all of you again next month.
Bye, everyone.
I thank you.